I remember that day like a movie I didn't mean to walk into. The courtroom smelled of coffee and tension. Lawyers whispered strategy, reporters scribbled notes, and the defendant, some Wall Street executive, sat polished and smug as if the verdict had already been prepaid. I wasn't supposed to be part of this story, at least, not yet. I sat in the last row wearing a plain gray suit, no tie, no badge. Just another face in the audience. The clerk glanced at me once, probably wondering if I was someone's assistant, or maybe the janitor who'd taken a wrong turn. I didn't mind. People make fast judgments when they think time is money. The prosecutor, a young woman barely out of law school, was sweating through her arguments. Her opponent, an older man with the kind of voice that fills rooms, was tearing her apart, line by line. The jury shifted in their seats, and the judge rubbed his temple like he'd already chosen a side. I'd seen it all before. Years in courtrooms teach you that truth doesn't always wear a nice suit. Sometimes it hides behind silence, waiting for arrogance to finish talking. When the cross-examination began, the defense attorney turned toward the jury, grinning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you're witnessing is a desperate attempt to paint my client as a criminal. There's no evidence, just emotion. No proof, just performance." He looked over at the prosecutor, then at the gallery. His eyes landed on me. "You," he said suddenly, pointing. "You've been watching every move. You look like you've got opinions. Maybe you think you could do her job better?" The courtroom turned. A few people chuckled. I smiled faintly, just enough for him to notice. "No, sir," I said quietly. "I just prefer facts over performance." He laughed. "Good answer." "You a lawyer?" I leaned forward slightly. "Not today." The judge banged his gavel lightly. "Let's focus on the case, counselor." But the room had shifted. The lawyer frowned, unsettled by how calm I was. Minutes later, during recess, the prosecutor gathered her papers in a panic. The judge had warned her, "If you can't substantiate your claim in the next session, I'll dismiss the case." I could see the fear in her eyes. She was alone and losing. That's when she noticed me. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "You, seem familiar? Have we met?" I hesitated, then stood. "Not officially," I said. "But you've read my work," she blinked. "Your work?" Before I could answer, the bailiff called everyone back. The trial resumed. As the defense began to gloat again, the prosecutor fumbled through her notes until I slipped a small folder onto her table as I passed by. She looked down, confused. Inside were 3 pages, a signature, and a date. Her eyes widened. "Your Honor," she said suddenly, her voice firm now, steady. "Before we proceed, I'd like to submit new evidence to the court. Financial records obtained through a federal review, authenticated this morning." The defense attorney froze. "That's impossible. No one had access to—" He stopped mid-sentence. His face drained of color as he recognized the signature at the bottom of the document. Judge Barrett adjusted his glasses. "Whose signature is that?" The prosecutor glanced at me. I gave her a slow nod. "Deputy District Attorney," she said, her voice clear. "Elias Ward." The courtroom went silent. The defense lawyer turned, eyes wide, finally realizing who I was. I stood up from the back row, buttoned my jacket, and said evenly, "Now that you know who's watching, counselor, shall we continue?" The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was justice breathing in. The courtroom didn't make a sound after that. You could feel every pair of eyes on me like heat pressing against glass. The defense attorney's grin had vanished, replaced by something closer to panic. He stammered, "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. He's not on the docket." Judge Barrett raised a hand. "Sit down, counselor. You've done enough talking for one morning." I took my time walking toward the front. Each step echoed heavier than it should have. I wasn't there to play hero. I was there because arrogance had made a mess that needed cleaning up, and someone had to do it. The prosecutor, Claire, that was her name, was still staring at me like she wasn't sure if I was real. She whispered, "You're the Elias Ward?" I smiled faintly. "Last time I checked," she blinked. "You wrote the Doctrine of Misconduct, the one every ethics class makes us read." "That's the one," I said. "Funny thing about that paper. It started with a case just like this one. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Ward, would you care to explain your involvement here? Gladly, I said. I've been investigating this defendant for 6 months. Embezzlement, money laundering. He's built an empire of clean hands and dirty pockets. I wasn't planning to reveal myself until the audit cleared, but the defense made it public. I shot a quick glance at the trembling lawyer. And I'm allergic to arrogance in court. A murmur rippled through the room. The jury leaned in. The defendant whispered furiously to his counsel. Claire straightened her shoulders, regaining her footing. Your Honor, she said, in light of Mr. Ward's testimony, I move to suspend proceedings pending review of this new evidence. The judge nodded. Granted, he turned to me. Mr. Ward, your presence has shifted the temperature in this courtroom. You're welcome to stay, but perhaps next time a little notice? Understood, I said, and for the first time all day there was the faintest hint of humor in my voice. When court adjourned, Claire caught up to me in the hallway. Why were you even here? She asked, voice still trembling between awe and confusion. I shrugged. Sometimes I like to see how truth behaves when no one thinks it's watching. She frowned. You set her up to win, I shook my head. I set justice up not to lose. Before I could walk away, a voice called out behind me, deep, shaky, desperate. The defense attorney. Ward, he shouted. You think this is over? You don't know who you're dealing with. I stopped, turned slowly, and met his eyes. That's where you're wrong, I said quietly. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The kind of man who forgets that the law is louder than his ego. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. As I walked toward the exit, the afternoon sun poured through the courthouse windows, painting long lines across the marble floor. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. But justice, I've learned, doesn't rest. It waits. And that day, as the echoes of the gavel still rang in my ears, I had the sinking feeling that this case was only the beginning. Because the moment truth shows its face, lies start learning how to fight back. The next morning, the courthouse looked the same. Polished floors, stale coffee, and the low hum of ambition in every corridor. But something in the air had changed. People moved slower when I walked by. Voices dropped mid-sentence. It wasn't respect. It was awareness. The kind that says someone saw what they weren't supposed to. By 9 a.m., Claire was waiting outside my office, holding a file that looked like it weighed more than she did. I didn't sleep, she said. I read through everything you submitted yesterday. You realize this case. It's bigger than one man, right? I motioned her in. That's why we don't pull one thread unless we're ready for the whole sweater to come apart. She placed the file on my desk and opened it to a series of bank statements, overlapping, transactions between the defendant's firm and a network of shell companies. These transfers match up with federal grant money, she said quietly. Money meant for housing reform. I felt my stomach tighten. So he wasn't just stealing. He was laundering hope. She looked up at me. You think someone higher up knew? I leaned back. Someone always knows. Before I could say more, my assistant buzzed in. Sir, there's a man downstairs asking for you. Says it's urgent. Claire frowned. A journalist? Worse, I said. A friend. I met him in the lobby. Detective Grant, a good cop in a bad department. He looked worn down, eyes ringed from sleepless nights. You've stirred something ugly, Elias, he said, voice low. That defense attorney you embarrassed yesterday? He's not just a lawyer. He's a fixer for half the city council, I sighed. And let me guess, now they're all suddenly interested in my work? He nodded. Phones are ringing. Files are moving. Someone wants this case buried before the week's out. Claire had followed us halfway down the hall. So what do we do? She asked. Grant looked at me waiting. I adjusted my cufflinks. That old habit from my trial days and said, we make it too loud to bury. That afternoon, I drafted a press brief. Careful, neutral, public enough to scare them without giving away evidence. The phone didn't stop ringing. Half were reporters, the other half lawyers pretending not to be nervous. At sunset, as the courthouse emptied, I stood by the window watching the city fade into shadow. You think we can win? Claire asked behind me. Win? I echoed, still watching the lights flicker on below. Justice doesn't win, Claire. It survives, She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The reflection in the glass caught my own face. Older, tired, but still steady. Somewhere out there, men with money and titles were rewriting the rules to protect themselves. But I had something they'd forgotten how to use. Patience. And patience in the right hands is just another name for justice waiting its turn. 2 days later, the hearing resumed. The courtroom felt heavier this time. Not from the crowd, but from the weight of everything unsaid. Reporters filled the back rows like vultures waiting for the next headline, while the defendant sat polished and smug again, as if nothing could touch him. Some people never learn until the floor disappears under them. I sat beside Claire this time, not behind her. My name was officially on the case now. The defense attorney kept his eyes fixed on his notes, pretending I didn't exist. That's the thing about arrogance. It hides behind paperwork when it runs out of confidence. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Ward, I understand you have something new for the court. I rose. Yes, Your Honor. A witness, one whose testimony should clarify where the missing funds went. The defense lawyer snorted. Another stunt, I assume? I smiled faintly. Only if the truth qualifies as performance art. He frowned but said nothing. I nodded toward the door, and a woman in a maintenance uniform entered, clutching a small binder to her chest. The courtroom murmured. Please state your name for the record, I said. Rosa Delgado, she answered nervously. And your occupation? Janitorial staff, Midtown Financial Building. Third floor? Accounting department. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. I could see the recognition flash across his face. He knew exactly who she was. Ms. Delgado, I continued gently, can you tell the court what you found on the night of June 17th? She swallowed hard. An envelope. Someone left it under my cart. Said it was trash, but it had papers in it. Bank records, signatures. I didn't understand them, but I recognized the names. I nodded. Did you bring those documents with you? She opened her binder, hands trembling, and passed it to the bailiff. The courtroom went still. The judge flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. These are transfer authorizations. Signed, I said quietly, by the defendant. The defense lawyer shot to his feet. Objection! This is manufactured! Sit down! Judge Barrett snapped. Unless you'd like me to subpoena the notary records myself? Rosa looked ready to cry. I stepped closer. You did the right thing, I told her softly. The truth always looks small when it's standing alone. But it doesn't stay small for long. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. The rest of the day passed in a blur of statements, objections, and silence so thick it felt alive. By the end, the courtroom no longer looked divided. It looked ashamed. When the session adjourned, Claire exhaled shakily beside me. You planned this? I shook my head. No. Justice just needed someone brave enough to sweep the floor. As we walked out, the reporters swarmed the steps outside, shouting questions, flashes popping. I paused for a moment under the marble archway, the sky dimming above the courthouse. Somewhere behind me, the defendant was still shouting about lies and setups. But his words didn't carry the same weight anymore. They just scattered in the air like dust, because when truth finally speaks, even a whisper sounds like thunder. By the next morning, the case was everywhere. Headlines, talk shows, late-night debates. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had the full story. That's the danger of truth once it escapes the courtroom. It doesn't walk, it runs. And it doesn't always stop where you want it to. When I arrived at the courthouse, Claire was already pacing the hall, phone pressed to her ear. They're calling it the Delgado leak, she said, hanging up. Half the city thinks we planted her, I sighed. They always attack the messenger before they admit the message is real. Inside the courtroom, the energy had changed. The defendant looked smaller now, not in size, but in confidence. His lawyer, the same one who once mocked me, kept dabbing sweat from his forehead, whispering furiously to his client. It was only day 4, but the walls were closing in fast. The judge entered, his expression unreadable. Mr. Ward, he said, before we proceed, I've received a petition from the defense. Let me guess, I said. They want the evidence thrown out? He nodded. They claim the witness was coerced. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Of course they do. When you can't fight the facts, fight the person who found them. The defense stood. Your Honor, this entire case has turned into a spectacle. My client is being tried in the court of public opinion. Correction, I interrupted. He's being tried in the court of accountability. It's about time those two met. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Ward, please. I took a breath, softening my tone. Your Honor, the only reason this feels like a spectacle is because no one expected someone like Ms. Delgado to matter. She wasn't supposed to be seen. She wasn't supposed to speak. That's why her truth hit harder than any of us planned. The courtroom went quiet again. Even the defendant stopped pretending not to listen. The judge turned to the defense. Petition denied. Proceed. We spent the next hours walking the jury through every document, every signature, every number that didn't add up. By the time we finished, the truth wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. When the session ended, Claire leaned over. You were calm up there, she whispered. Colder than usual, I smiled faintly. Because this part isn't about anger. It's about letting the truth do what it's meant to. She looked at me curiously. And what's that? End the noise, I said. Outside, the air was thick with the sound of reporters shouting questions. I didn't stop. There was nothing left to explain. The truth had its own voice now, and it was louder than any of us. As I reached the steps, I glanced back at the courthouse, that grand gray building where lies come to die slowly. Justice wasn't won yet. But it was awake, and that, in this city, was already a miracle. The verdict was still days away, but everyone in the courthouse could feel it. That strange stillness before something finally collapses. The defense had stopped shouting. The press had stopped guessing. Even the marble floors seemed quieter, like they were holding their breath. That morning, Claire found me in my office, a folder clutched against her chest. You're not going to like this, she said. I looked up from my notes. Start with the part I won't like least. She opened the folder. Inside were photos, the defendant shaking hands with a city councilman, a developer, and someone I didn't expect to see. My jaw tightened. The judge? She nodded. Taken 3 months ago at a fundraiser unreported. And the donations? She slid another paper across the desk. Same accounts that showed up in the embezzlement trail. For a second, the room went cold. Not because I was surprised, corruption never hides far, but because I knew what this meant. If the judge was compromised, the entire verdict was tainted before it even began. Claire's voice dropped. If this gets out, it'll burn the whole case down. I closed the folder slowly. No, I said. It'll burn down what needed burning. An hour later, I walked into the courtroom, folder in hand. The judge glanced up, startled to see me before the session began. Mr. Ward, this isn't procedure. No, I interrupted quietly. But corruption rarely is. I placed the folder on his bench. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he flipped it open, and his expression broke. Color drained from his face. The defense attorney rose, already sensing the shift. Your Honor, Judge Barrett's hands trembled slightly. Court is in recess, he said, voice cracking. He stood too quickly and disappeared through the side door. The room erupted, whispers, gasps, phones buzzing. Claire leaned toward me. You just ended your career, she whispered. I smiled faintly. Then it's a good ending. By that evening, the news had exploded. Judge Barrett under federal inquiry. The city was on fire, politically speaking. Every name that once sat untouchable at high tables was now flashing across headlines. Later that night, as I left the courthouse, I found Rosa, the janitor who'd started all this, standing by the steps. She looked nervous. Did I do something wrong? She asked. I shook my head. You did the hardest thing a person can do in this city. You told the truth and stayed to see what it cost. She smiled weakly. And you? I looked out over the skyline, lights flickering like sparks in the dark. Me? I just reminded them that justice still knows how to fight back. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not triumph. Justice doesn't deal in that. Just quiet. The kind that means the truth finally found its voice. And in that silence, for a moment, I thought I could hear the city breathe again. The next morning, the courthouse didn't feel like a courthouse anymore. It felt like a confession booth. Every step echoed too loudly. Every conversation stopped when I passed. The same men who used to shake my hand with rehearsed smiles now avoided my eyes like guilt itself had a reflection. Claire was waiting in my office, phone in hand. "They confirmed it," she said. "Barrett's off the bench. The councilman, the developer, federal warrants went out this morning." She hesitated. "You did it, Elias." I shook my head. "We didn't do anything. They did. We just turned the lights on," she sighed, sitting down. "You ever get tired of pretending you're not a hero?" I smiled faintly. "Heroes fix what's broken. I just point at the cracks. By noon, the Department of Justice had stepped in. I spent the day in interviews, answering the same questions in different tones. When did you know? Why didn't you report it sooner? Were you afraid? The truth is, yes. I was afraid. You always are when the truth starts cutting too deep. But fear doesn't stop justice. It just slows her down until she finds her footing again." When I stepped outside, the air was thick with rain. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, shouting questions I didn't bother answering. Across the street, the same black car from weeks ago idled at the curb. Grant, the detective, leaned out the window. "You made quite a mess, Ward," I climbed in. "Mess makes things grow," I said. "Clean floors just hide the rot," he chuckled. "The DA's office wants to offer you the lead on internal affairs." I stared out the window. "I'm not interested in politics." "It's not politics," he said. "It's survival. They need someone people still believe in." I thought about that as we drove through the city. Billboards, flashing lights, people pretending the world was simpler than it really was. "Belief," I said finally, "isn't justice. It's comfort. And comfort's how we got here." When I got home, the house was dark except for the lamp by my father's old chair. He'd been a judge once, one of the good ones. I sat where he used to sit and opened the file Claire had left on my desk. Inside were a dozen new complaints, each one smaller than the last. Clerks underpaid, cases delayed, witnesses ignored. It hit me then. Justice doesn't end when the headline fades. It just moves to a smaller room waiting for someone else to listen. The rain tapped against the window like a gavel. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for the first time since this all began, I didn't feel angry. I felt ready. Tomorrow there would be another case. Another lie dressed like truth. Another courtroom pretending not to choose sides. And when it happened, I'd be there again. Not to save anyone, not to play hero, but to make sure no one ever mistook silence for justice again. It rained the day the verdict came down, the kind of slow, steady rain that makes cities sound honest for once. The courthouse was full, though no one said a word. Even the press seemed to understand that this wasn't a day for noise. The jury filed in, eyes heavy from weeks of watching masks fall off people they used to trust. When the foreman stood, his voice didn't shake. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." No one cheered, no gasps. Just a collective exhale that felt like the city had been holding its breath for years. The defendant's lawyer slumped back in his chair, defeated. The man himself, once so polished, so untouchable, just stared at the table. For the first time, he looked human. Maybe that's the quiet mercy of justice. It doesn't destroy, it reveals. Claire squeezed my arm gently. "It's over," she whispered. I nodded, but I knew better. Justice doesn't end with a gavel. It lingers, in paperwork, in memories, in the eyes of people who finally believe again. After the crowd cleared, I stayed behind. The courtroom felt smaller now, stripped of its illusions. I walked to the witness stand and ran my fingers across the wood. This place had seen more lies than confessions, but for once, the truth had won around. Judge Barrett's seat was empty, his nameplate gone. For a second, I imagined my father sitting there instead, his steady voice reminding me that justice was never about glory, only balance. Claire joined me, standing quietly. "You ever think it's worth it?" she asked. I looked at her. Every time someone remembers. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds broke just enough to let a sliver of light spill across the courthouse steps. Reporters waited, cameras blinking red, but for once I didn't rush past them. I paused at the top of the stairs, breathing in the damp air that smelled faintly of change. A young journalist stepped forward. "Mr. Ward, what does this verdict mean for the city?" I met her gaze and smiled softly. "It means justice isn't gone," I said. She just needed someone to remind her where the courtroom was. They wrote that line on every front page the next day. Some called it poetic. Some called it naive. I didn't care, because when the city lights came on that night, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, people walking a little slower, talking a little quieter, like they were finally listening again. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned.